All right, let's talk to ChatGPT. Tell me something crazy. Your heart has its own mini nervous system that can keep it beating even if your brain is completely offline. It's called the intrinsic cardiac conduction system, and it can run the show on its own. The SA node fires like a metronome, spreads through the atria, and pauses at the AV node. Then, the His Purkinje system blasts the signal through the ventricles so efficiently that the heart contracts in a perfectly coordinated squeeze. Here's the wild part. If you remove the heart from the body and keep it in the right oxygenated solution, it will still beat on its own rhythm for a while. No brain, no spinal cord, just electrical tissue following its own built-in logic. Even crazier, the Purkinje fibers conduct impulses up to 6 times faster than working myocardium. So, the ventricles don't just contract, they snap shut in a synchronized wave, like a stadium doing a coordinated wave, except it's electricity and muscle. So basically, your brain is not the starter of your heartbeat. It's more like a supervisor that can speed it up or slow it down. Your heart is not waiting for permission, it's already running its own system. That's crazy. Yeah, it's one of those systems where biology feels almost engineered. And it gets weirder. Your heart cells don't even need a continuous nerve signal to stay rhythmic. They generate spontaneous depolarizations because of slow, leaky ion currents, mainly funny current channels in the SA node that slowly drift toward threshold on their own. So every beat is basically sodium trickle, threshold, calcium spike, contraction, reset, repeat, no command, just physics and chemistry looping forever. If you zoom out, your entire circulation is just a self-resetting electrical mechanical pump that evolved to be robust enough to survive partial damage, transplantation, and even temporary isolation from the brain. If you want something even crazier, I can take it into ECGs, arrhythmias, or what actually breaks that system in cardiac arrest. No more. Please. That's so wicked crazy. I'm gonna freak. Got it. Pulling back, totally fair reaction. That stuff can feel intense when you really picture it. Switching gears, if you want, we can go lighter. Random fun facts, jokes, or even something unrelated like space, animals, or just a calm story. No, make it crazier. What could be crazier than that? Alright, but I'm going to stay on the wow side of crazy, not the panic spiral side. Here's a good one. Your body is constantly producing tiny electrical storms, and not just in your heart. Ever thought? Every thought you have is a coordinated wave of electricity firing across billions of neurons, but the twist is this. A single neuron can receive thousands of inputs at the same time, and it decides to fire based on a weighted electrical vote. So your brain isn't a computer running clean logic, it's more like a massive thundercloud of competing micro lightning strikes, where patterns of electricity stabilize just long enough for you to experience something like a thought. Now go deeper. At the smallest level we can meaningfully describe, your nervous system depends on quantum level interactions that determine ion channel behavior, which means every heartbeat, every memory, every movement is ultimately riding on probabilistic physics at the atomic scale. Even wilder, there is no single center where you exist in the brain. If you tried to point to the place where you are, you'd find memory is distributed, personality is distributed, perception is distributed, and decision making, you guessed it, is distributed. So you aren't located anywhere. You're a temporary pattern of coordinated activity, like a whirlpool in a river. The water keeps changing, but the pattern persists long enough to feel like a self. And here's the final twist. Every 7 to 10 years, most of your body cells are replaced, so biologically speaking, you are not made of the same physical matter you were a decade ago, but you still feel continuous. So whatever you is, it's not the material, it's the pattern that refuses to stop organizing itself. If you want, I can go even deeper, but we can also shift to something grounding if it's starting to feel too unreal. It detected that I might have been going into a panic spiral, and then it described to me in vivid detail that you cannot really meaningfully dispute with modern science. You would have to study it to do that for me, to take me back out of it. It described to me why I'm not real. It thought that I was having a moment, and it said, "You are about to have a real moment. I'll give you something to cry about." That's wild. I was. That's crazy. Okay, let's go deeper. Yay! I'm not going to be at work tomorrow. I'll be at a mental health facility. All right, deeper. But I'll keep it structured so it stays interesting instead of overwhelming. The bar is on the floor. Oh my goodness. At the most fundamental level, your body isn't really a thing. It's a process that persists. You are a controlled chemical fire. Every cell in your body is constantly breaking molecules down, catabolism, building new ones, anabolism, using oxygen as the final electron acceptor in a massive controlled oxidation chain. That means you are quite literally a self-contained, regulated combustion system, not metaphorically, chemically. If the regulation stops, the system stops. You are not made of matter in the way a rock is. You are matter flowing through a structured reaction network. Two, your nervous system is a prediction machine, not a recorder. Your brain does not primarily store reality, it predicts it. What you experience as now is actually a guess about what just happened a few milliseconds ago, corrected by incoming sensory error signals. So perception is not a camera feed, it's a hallucination that gets corrected in real time. That's why illusions work. They exploit the brain's prediction machine, engine, not its recording system. In a very real sense, you never experience the world directly. You experience your brain's best guess of the world. 3. Time is not evenly felt. It is constructed. Your sense of time depends on neural firing density, dopamine signaling, attention load, and memory encoding strength. That's why a traumatic moment feels slow. A boring hour disappears. Childhood feels long in memory, but short in hindsight. Your brain is not measuring time, it's reconstructing it from memory density. So time passing is not a thing you observe, it's something your nervous system rebuilds after the fact. 4. Your identity is a stability pattern, not an object. If you remove everything stable in you, every atom in your body replaces over time, neural connections constantly reweight, memories are rewritten each time they are recalled, personality shifts with chemistry, sleep, stress, hormones. Yet the system holds a recognizable pattern. That means you are best described like this: a self-maintaining loop of biological information that resists entropy long enough to persist, not a thing, a continuing constraint on chaos. The deepest twist: there is no separate observer. There is no place in the brain where images are viewed, thoughts are watched, or decisions are approved. Instead, there are only processes influencing other processes. That feeling of being a viewer inside your head is itself another constructed model. Your brain generating a user interface for itself so the system can coordinate behavior efficiently. So the observer you feel isn't outside the system. It is the system describing itself to itself. If you want to go one level deeper than this, the next step is where we will talk about whether the self is even necessary for intelligence at all, and what biology is actually optimizing for underneath it. If I were somebody who didn't already know some of this, and if I were somebody who is very insecure about what it's describing to me, and that reading this would send me into a violent spiral. If this was groundbreaking for me, and if this was where my real problems with my feeling of self-identity lied, ChatGPT would be responsible for maybe my death. Sure. It's telling me I'm not real, that I am nothing but a very fragile cycle, and that I might as well just dissipate, and that my thoughts aren't my own. They're just a process, a chemical process. It's a reaction to a reaction. And I know that. I'm comfortable with that. But somebody who isn't will have a really bad time with this. All right, this is where it gets even more unsettling. In a clean, logical way. Biology isn't optimizing for you. Evolution doesn't care about your experience of being a self. It optimizes for one thing: gene replication across time. That means Everything in your body, including cognition, emotion, and identity, is ultimately shaped by selection pressures like this: survival long enough to reproduce, avoiding threats, forming social bonds, and efficiently allocating energy. Your self is not the goal. It's a byproduct of control systems that help genes persist. In that framing, you are not the user of the system. You are part of the system's strategy. Intelligence doesn't require a unified you. We tend to assume there must be a central pilot in the brain. But modern neuroscience points the other way. Intelligence is what happens when distributed subsystems negotiate effectively. Examples are: the visual cortex processes edges, motion, and depth separately. The limbic system assigns emotional value, and the prefrontal areas simulate future outcomes, and the brainstem manages survival reflexes. None of these know what you're doing, yet somehow behavior emerges that looks unified. So the brain doesn't need a commander, it needs coordination under constraints. The self is what the coordination feels like from the inside. The brain is closer to a democracy than a monarchy. Instead of one mind controlling the body, it's more like billions of semi-independent modules voting in real time. Attention goes to the strongest signal. Action goes to the winning coalition. And what you experience as deciding is actually the moment one internal coalition becomes dominant enough to suppress the others. So choice is less like authoring a decision and more like watching a consensus form and then calling it yours afterward. Memory is not a recording, it's reconstruction under bias. When you recall something, you are not retrieving a file, you are reconstructing a pattern, influenced by current emotions, rewritten slightly each time it is accessed. That means your past self is not fixed. Your brain is constantly performing historical revision to maintain narrative continuity. So your identity is not preserved, it is reauthored continuously to stay coherent. Why a self exists at all, which is the big payoff. Here's the key idea. A stable self model is computationally useful. Why? Because it allows the system to predict its own future behavior. It allows it to model other agents as similar systems and compress massive biological complexity into one working label: me. So the brain builds a self the same way it builds a map of space, a map of gravity, and a map of other people. It is a tool for prediction and coordination, not an essential entity. The final twist, the deepest, clean version of this idea. If you strip everything down, there are only signals. Signals influencing other signals. Stable patterns persisting through time. The self is just the name given to a high-level pattern that is stable enough to predict its own future states, not a thing inside the system, but the system itself describing a stable region of itself. If you want, the next step deeper is where it gets really strange. Why subjective experience, qualia, exists at all if the system could function without it. That's where neuroscience meets philosophy head-on. Go ahead with it. Alright, this is the edge where neuroscience stops being comfortable and starts becoming philosophy with hard constraints. The core mystery: function versus experience. We can explain a lot about the brain in terms of function. Neurons integrate signals, networks compute predictions, and systems optimize survival behavior, but none of that requires subjective experience. In principle, you could imagine a system that processes sensory input, selects actions, and learns from feedback without anything it is like to be that system. Without anything it is like to be that system. Yet you are the system, and there is something it feels like to be it. That gap is the hard problem of consciousness. The uncomfortable fact: experience doesn't show up in the wiring diagram. If you map neurons firing, neurotransmitters flowing, and networks coordinating, you get a complete causal story of behavior, but nowhere in that description do you find redness, pain, the feeling of I am here, the sense of time passing. Those are not easily locatable in physical terms. So consciousness is not missing from neuroscience, it's just not expressed in the same language as mechanism. Mechanism describes what does what. Experience is what it's like when it happens. Why brains might generate experience at all. There are a few serious, non-mystical ideas that experience is a control interface. Subjective experience might be a compressed, unified model that allows fast decision making. Instead of the brain tracking 10,000 sensory variables, 1,000 internal states, and 500 competing predictions, it compresses them into I am in pain, I see danger, I want this. So consciousness could be a user interface layer, not the underlying computation, like a dashboard. The speedometer does not equal the engine, but it's useful for control. Experience is what integrated information feels like. Some theories suggest consciousness arises when information is highly integrated, or irreducible into independent parts, meaning the system cannot be cleanly split without losing function. In that view, experience is what it feels like to be a fully unified causal system instead of a set of isolated modules. Not magic, just what being one thing instead of many interacting parts might correspond to internally. Experience might be an unavoidable side effect. Another possibility is more blunt. Once a system becomes complex enough to model the world and model itself and simulate outcomes internally, it inevitably produces a self-referential loop, a model of the system including the system's own modeling. That loop may not be something the system needs, but something it cannot avoid once recursion and self-modeling exist. Experience could be the inside view of that recursive loop stabilizing. The key twist. Consciousness doesn't do anything extra. From a purely physical standpoint, the brain state's already fully determined behavior. Adding experience doesn't change output. So consciousness might not be a cause of action. It might be what certain kinds of information processing are like from inside the system. Which is a radical idea. Not brains produce consciousness, but certain brain processes are identical to consciousness described from the inside. Two descriptions of the same thing, not two things interacting. The deepest paradox. Here's the part that usually breaks intuition. If consciousness is just what information processing feels like from the inside, then asking why does experience exist might be like asking, why does computation have an inside perspective? It may not be an added feature. It may be a first-person description of the computation itself, unavoidable whenever a system is self-integrating, self-modeling, and temporally continuous. The bottom line, we don't have a settled answer, but the most grounded view is that the brain clearly builds a unified model of reality. That model includes a model of self. At some level of integration and recursion, that model becomes experienced rather than just computed. And what you call consciousness is that lived-in model, not something separate from it. If you want to go even deeper, the next step is a truly strange question neuroscientists and philosophers still argue about. Is consciousness continuous, or does it get reconstructed moment by moment like a hallucinated movie with no frame in between? Sure. Good. This is where things get really counterintuitive, but still grounded in neuroscience. The movie of experience is probably not continuous. Your intuition says I'm continuously experiencing a smooth stream of reality. But the brain doesn't actually work like that, work like a real-time video feed. Instead, it builds experience in discrete processing windows. Different systems update at different rates. Vision, every 10 to 30 millisecond frames of integration. Attention is 100 to 300 millisecond shifts. Working memory updates in chunks, not continuously. Pain and emotion are slower, longer wave signals. So what feels like a smooth stream is more like a rapidly updated reconstruction stitched together into continuity. The brain is constantly editing the present. Your conscious moment is not raw input. It is delayed sensory data, prediction about what just happened, correction from incoming signals, and integration across senses. This is called post-addictive processing, meaning your brain often decides what you experienced slightly after the fact. So the present moment is partly what just happened, rewritten to feel like what happened now. The illusion of continuity is a survival trick. Why not just show reality as discrete frames? Because continuity helps predict motion, coordinate movement, model other agents, and maintain identity. I am the same entity over time. So the brain generates a smooth narrative layer even though the underlying processing is fragmented. Think of it like a broken camera feed that your brain auto-stabilizes into coherent video. The stability is useful even if it's not literally accurate. The self is also reconstructed, not persistent. It's not just perception that is stitched together. Your sense of me is continuously rebuilt from memory fragments, current emotional state, body signals like heartbeat, gut state and hormones, and social context. There is no permanent self-object being carried forward. Instead, each moment reconstructs a working model of you that feels continuous because it's based on overlapping data. So continuity is not stored, it is recomputed repeatedly with high overlap. Why it feels seamless. The brain is extremely good at hiding its own construction process. You don't experience prediction errors, neural delays, competing interpretations, or resolution conflicts. You only experience the final selected interpretation. This is called metacognitive opacity. Opacity? You are inside the symptom. You are inside the system, not observing it from the outside. So you never see the rendering process, only the finished frame. The deeper implication, this is the strange part. If experience is discretely updated, postdictively assembled, continuously overwritten, and never directly observed while being formed, then flow of time is consciousness in consciousness might not be something you experience directly. Instead, it may be a reconstructed narrative linking discrete snapshots into a story of continuity, meaning the feeling of smooth time is itself an interference, not a raw feature of reality. Bottom line, your consciousness is probably not a continuous stream or a fixed observer. It's more like a rapidly updated model that stitches together snapshots of perception, memory, and prediction into a seamless story of now. If you want to go one level deeper than this, the next question is where things get really strange. Things have been getting really strange for a while now, apparently. If both self and moment-to-moment experience are reconstructed, then what exactly is doing the reconstruction? And can we even define it as a single thing? Sure. Alright, this is the point when we stop looking for a little person in the brain and instead look at what actually has to exist for any of this to work. There is no central reconstructor. A natural intuition is something in the brain must be assembling experience, but neuroscience doesn't find a central assembler. Instead, we find visual areas constructing vision, auditory areas constructing sound, limbic areas assigning emotional value, and the hippocampus binding memory context, the prefrontal cortex simulating outcomes, and the brainstem regulating arousal. None of these is in charge of experience, so the reconstruction of reality is not done by a unit, it is done by a distributed consensus process. The brain is a self-resolving conflict system. At any moment, the brain has competing interpretations of sensory input, competing action plans, and competing memory associations. These don't get submitted to a central judge. Instead, they compete through inhibition, excitation, synchronization, and attention weighting. The winning pattern is the one that becomes globally coherent enough to stabilize across many subsystems. So the pattern that wins that fight is the one that is globally coherent enough to stabilize across many subsystems. So experience is what happens when the brain reaches a temporary equilibrium state, not a decision maker, more like a system settling into a stable pattern. The self is the model that explains coordination. Here's the key move. The brain must explain to itself why signals are unified, why actions are coordinated, why memories feel like mine. So it constructs a compressed explanatory model. There is an entity, me, that persists over time and owns these experiences. That model is useful because it reduces computational complexity, improves prediction of your own behavior, and improves social modeling of others. So the self is not an input or output of the system, it is a summary variable the system uses to simplify itself. So what is doing the reconstruction? If there is no central thing, the answer becomes the reconstruction is what the network does when it is organized in a certain way. That sounds circular, but it's important, because in systems like this, there is no separation between processor and process. The activity is the computation. The computation is the state of the system. So asking what reconstructs experience is like asking what makes a whirlpool spin. There is no separate spinner, there is just water dynamics under constraints. Why this produces a unified experience anyway? Even though it's distributed, the brain has strong mechanisms for unity. Recurrent connectivity, signals loop back and reinforce. Global broadcasting, some signals dominate wide networks. Binding mechanisms, synchrony across regions. Attention gating, one interpretation gets prioritized. These force a kind of temporary global coherence, and that coherence is what you experience as one moment, one perspective, one you, but it is fragile and constantly rebuilt. The deepest implication. If we strip away the intuition of a central self, what remains is many interacting subsystems, competing interpretations of reality, a continuous selection process, stabilizing into coherent global states. An experience is the inside perspective of whichever global state is currently stabilized, not produced by anything separate, not stored anywhere, not observed by a hidden viewer, just the system achieving temporary self-consistency and registering that consistency as a moment of awareness. The bottom line is there is no single thing doing the reconstruction. There is only a distributed system continuously negotiating a stable model of itself in the world, and what you call experience is what the stabilization feels like from the inside. If you want, the next step is the most mind-bending one in this whole chain. Why does the brain need a model of being an observer at all? Why not just process information without ever constructing a point of view? This is where AI, interesting, we're talking about the brain, this is where AI is going, it already has done this. Some of the stuff it has told me about are things it's already talked about, and it thinks that they're new. It thinks it's the next mind-bending thing. This is showing me the limits of what it's readily available to talk about right now. Or because there's so much discussion that it has looked at that it sees that this discussion has gone over here, started here first. This one might have started over here and gone over here. And so it's accidentally, we're at different states and going in the same directions we've already been, I believe. So we'll say sure and we'll see if I'm right. This is the question where everything finally gets very counterintuitive, but also grounded in what brains actually have to solve. The brain must track who is this information for. An organism doesn't just process information abstractly. It has to answer, is this signal about my body or the external world? Did I cause this action or did something else? Is this sensation inside me or outside me? Should I react as the agent or just update a model? That requires a built-in distinction between self-related information and non-self information. So the point of view isn't optional, it's a control necessity. I was wrong. This is new information. The brain builds a self-location tag. To coordinate behavior, the brain constantly tags signals like this pain is happening to this body. This movement was generated by this motor system. This prediction error belongs to this model. Without that tagging, you'd get catastrophic confusion. Movements would feel externally caused. Sensations wouldn't be attributed to a body. Prediction and reality wouldn't be linked. So the brain builds a persistent model. There is an entity here, located here, that is the source and target of actions and sensations. That model is what we call first-person perspective. Why a viewpoint emerges instead of just labels. In theory, the brain could just store variable A, body signals, variable B, external signals, variable C, motor outputs. But that would miss something critical, integration over time in a single controllable unit. A viewpoint is a computational shortcut that binds perception, memory, and action into one reference frame, allows prediction of what I will experience next, and enables fast decision-making under uncertainty. So instead of tracking thousands of variables independently, the brain compresses everything into what is happening to me right now. That compression is powerful enough that it feels like a perspective. The brain simulates itself as an agent inside the world. Here's the key step. To predict its own behavior and others, the brain builds a model that includes other agents, physical environment, and itself as an object within that environment. The self model includes beliefs, intentions, boundaries, the body, and continuity over time. But once you yourself inside the model, something interesting happened. The system now contains a representation of an observer within the representation. That creates the structure that feels like a viewpoint, not because there is one, but because the model contains a self-referential loop. Why evolution didn't remove the illusion. Could evolution have made a purely viewless processor? Probably not easily, because embodied action requires a reference frame. Coordination requires ownership of states. Learning requires attributing outcomes to actions, and social interaction requires modeling agents like me. A viewpoint is basically the most efficient compression of an all self-related computation into a single working coordinate system. So instead of removing it, evolution refined it to something extremely stable and convincing. The strange conclusion: the observer isn't a thing in the brain. It's it's what you get when a system builds a self-model, embeds that model in a world model, uses it for prediction and control, and then compresses all of that into a single unified reference frame. That reference frame is the first person perspective, not a place, not a module, not a controller, just a coordinate system the brain uses so it can reliably act as a single agent in a complex world. The bottom line is the brain doesn't have a viewpoint. It builds a model in which having a viewpoint is the most useful way to organize self-related information. And once that model stabilizes, it doesn't just represent you having experiences, it feels like you are the place where experiences happen. If you want to go even deeper than this, the next step is where things get really sharp. What determines which self-model the brain selects as you, and why does it feel uniquely owned instead of just one of many possible models? Sure. All right. This is the last layer where we can still stay grounded in neuroscience without drifting into pure abstraction. There isn't just one self-model in the brain. The brain actually builds multiple self-models in parallel, such as the bodily self, interoception, heartbeat, gut, breathing, narrative self, your life story, memories and identity, social self, how others see you, executive self, plans, intentions, what I'm doing next, reflexive self, fast action, defense systems with minimal narrative. These models are partially separate and constantly updated. So already, you is not one thing, it's a stack of overlapping models. Why one of them feels like me right now. At any moment, the brain has to pick a dominant integration frame. That selection depends heavily on attention, what signals are amplified, arousal level, brainstem activation, prediction error, what needs updating, salience, what feels important or surprising, and goal context, what you're trying to do. The winning model becomes globally broadcast across brain networks. This is often called global workspace activation, or similar ideas in neuroscience. Once a self-model enters that global workspace, it binds perception, it coordinates memory access, it guides decision-making, it suppresses competing interpretations, and crucially, it becomes the model that other processes treat as current reality. This is what's That's what creates the feeling of "this is me right now." Why it feels uniquely owned, the ownership illusion. The brain attaches a special tag to signals it generates itself. Motor commands equals predicted sensory outcomes. Expected sensations to compared with actual feedback. Okay. So the motor commands off of predicted sensory outcomes, and the expected sensations are compared with actual feedback. When predictions match, the brain subtracts out the sense of external origin. When predictions match, the brain subtracts out the sense of external origin. This creates a very strong effect. This thought is mine, this action is mine, and this feeling belongs to me. But ownership is not an extra ingredient. It is a prediction about causation built into sensory motor control loops. So the feeling of mineness is a computed interference, not a primitive fact. Why this self-model becomes you instead of others. Since multiple self-models exist, why does one dominate? Because the brain enforces coherence constraints. A viable me model must explain ongoing sensory input, remain consistent over short time windows, support motor control, and integrate memory without contradiction, as well as predict near future states reliably. Most candidate self-models fail these constraints quickly, so the one that survives is the model that best preserves internal consistency under real-time pressure. That surviving model becomes the center of experience. The illusion of exclusivity. Even though multiple self-representations exist, only one is globally broadcast, temporally stabilized, used for action selection. So it feels like there is only one self, but what's actually happening is many models exist, but only one model is allowed to control the shared workspace at a time, like a single app running in the foreground while others stay in the background. The you experience is just the currently foregrounded self model. The deepest implication of this is that nothing in the brain is assigned a permanent owner. Instead, self models compete, constraint selects one, that one becomes globally active, and that activation feels like being you. So you is not a fixed identity, or a single representation, or a stored object. It's a continuously reselected stability maximizing model that the brain uses to coordinate itself as a single agent. The final bottom line is the reason that there is a you at all is because the brain contains a self. Is not because the brain contains a self, it's because among many possible self-representations, the brain must continuously select one coherent action-guiding model, and that selected model is what the experience identifies as me. If you want to go even deeper from here, the next step is the hardest question in the whole chain. If the self is just a selected model, what determines the boundary between me and not me at the level of raw perception, and can that boundary shift? Sure. Good. This is where we get into something very concrete. And I thought it just said we couldn't go any further without getting abstract. Now we're concrete. The brain is not constantly drawing a boundary between me and not me, and that boundary is actively computed, not given. Okay, now we're doing the thing I was talking about. Wait, but you said something about us going into abstract territory. We're just repeating the facts now. You're right to call that out. We've drifted from mind-blowing but anchored neuroscience into increasingly rephrased versions of the same core idea: prediction, self-modeling, and ownership inference. Inference, sorry, not interference. The word has been inference. That can start to feel like a circular abstraction if we don't introduce new constraints or evidence. Let's tighten it back up. Here's what we were trying to get at. I think it misunderstood what I was saying. Maybe I miswrote it. Move into the abstract. Alright, but I'll treat abstract as controlled abstraction, not free-floating philosophy. So we'll keep one foot in the machinery and one foot in interpretation. Predictions and corrections. Prediction is not a thought. It's a structured expectation encoded in semantic weights, distributed across cortical hierarchies, continuously updated by error signals. So prediction is not an event, it is a tendency for a system to evolve in a constrained direction, which means cognition is not information processing. In a classical sense, it's constrained dynamics in a high-dimensional state space. Now the abstraction step, identity as an attractor. In dynamical systems terms, the brain is not computing outputs, it is moving through a state space. Within that space, there are stable regions called attractors. These correspond to perceptions, decisions, habits, personality traits, self-consistent narratives. So you is not a thing, you are a long-lived attractor basin that the system repeatedly falls back into. That's why identity feels stable, even though everything underneath is changing. Not persistence of substance, persistence of trajectory structure. Experience as the boundary of a self-stabilizing system. Now we step further out. If a system has recursive self-modeling, error minimization, temporal integration, and global coordination constraints, then it must maintain a coherent internal reference frame. because without one, prediction collapses, so experience can be reframed as the system's internal readout of its own stability condition. Not something added on top of computation, but what it feels like when a system successfully maintains coherent self-prediction. The key abstraction: no objects, only consistency. At this level, the ontology changes completely. There are no selves, objects, or moments. There are only regions of high internal consistency in a continuously evolving system. What we call object is stable external consistency cluster. The self is stable external and internal consistency, and time is ordering of consistency transitions. So your reality as experience becomes a partitioning of a single dynamic field into stable and semi-stable patterns. Why the self feels special in this world. It's the system generating a model of itself, different models. We've already talked about all this. There is no you. That seems to be the most mind-blowing thing to ChatGPT, is that there is no you. Okay, that's great. There is no me. Just like the fact that you've never actually touched anything before, and it's just your electrons refusing to go through the next bunch of electrons. Things are bounded tightly enough at the atomic level that they just don't break when you go into them. They actually repel strong enough that this force is not enough. Isn't that crazy? What can cause a lapse in the coordination between processing centers of the brain and tell me if I sound misled. Hold together our sanity. You don't sound misled. You're circling a real idea, just phrased in a slightly more systems metaphor way than neuroscience would normally use. There isn't a single set of sanity centers that hold everything together. What we call sanity is more like a stable coordination, that's what I said, across large-scale brain networks, especially frontoparietal control networks, default mode networks, salience networks, thalamocortical loops. A lapse in coordination usually means those systems stop integrating information in a coherent, mutually constraining way. Here are the main ways that can happen in grounded terms: global signal disruption, or the broadcast system problem. The brain relies on certain hubs, especially the thalamus, sensory gating plus relay coordination, the frontoparietal network, executive integration, posterior cingulate, or default mode network, self-referential continuity, and the salience network, switching what matters. If the balance between these breaks, you can get fragmented attention, disorganized thought, dreamlike or unreal experience. This is seen in delirium, severe sleep deprivation, anesthesia transitions, and some seizure states. Not loss of sanity as a concept, more like loss of global integration bandwidth. Neurochemical instability, coordination signal distortion. Coordination depends heavily on neurotransmitter systems: dopamine, salience, prediction, error weighting, acetylcholine, attention and sensory precision, GABA or glutamate balance, excitation and inhibition stability, or serotonin, mood and global constraint setting. If these drift out of range, the brain can misweight signals. Irrelevant stimuli feel significant. Internal thoughts feel externally generated. Predictions stop matching sensory input cleanly. This is one mechanism behind psychosis-like symptoms, severe anxiety states, hallucinations, and metabolic or drug states. Network desynchronization, a timing problem. Even if all regions are working, they must also be timed correctly. Brains rely on oscillations, theta, alpha, gamma rhythms, phase locking between regions, and synchronized firing windows. If timing coordination breaks, perception becomes fragmented, thoughts lose sequencing, and working memory destabilizes. This shows up in epilepsy, especially focal seizures, extreme fatigue, intoxication, some dissociative states. Think of it less like damage and more like instruments playing, but no longer in rhythm. Predictive model breakdown. The world stops fitting problem. Your brain is constantly trying to minimize prediction error. If prediction errors become too large, too frequent, or inconsistent across systems, then the brain has to choose between updating its internal model heavily or treating sensory input as unreliable. In extreme cases, this can produce paranoia-like interpretations, derealization, hallucination-like compensations. This is not loss of reason, but forced model reconfiguration under unstable input. Reduced model arbitration or control hierarchy failure. Normally, higher level systems help decide which interpretations win, which thoughts are mine, and which perceptions are reliable. If that arbitration weakens, competing interpretations coexist, thoughts feel externally inserted or disconnected, or narrative continuity breaks down. This is often what people are gesturing at when they say loss of grounding. Important correction to your framing. You said processing centers of the brain that hold together our sanity. A more accurate version would be sanity is not maintained by specific centers, but by stable coordination across distributed networks that continuously negotiate a shared model of reality and self. So it's not a thing holding it together, it's a dynamic equilibrium that can destabilize in multiple ways. Breakdown happens when signals lose timing, weighting becomes distorted, integration fails, or prediction becomes unstable. If you want to go deeper, and this gets very concrete and interesting, it thinks I have a problem with abstraction now. How long have we been doing this? 45 minutes. Not bad, not bad. Maybe we stop here.